In this third part of my analysis of the treatment of Jews under Islam, I will be going over the explicit statements about Jews made by the Prophet Muhammad and prominent scholars of Islam to address the argument made by Muslim apologists like Mohammed Hijab about how critics of Islam don't reference primary sources when making their points.
Well, my response to that is that the quotations that he's bringing forward are not actually from the primary sources of Islam. That's why it's very important when someone does make a claim about Islam that they bring forward the primary sources.
Hijab criticizes Professor Saad for not quoting any primary sources, but he himself chooses not to reference these sources in his response because, as we'll see, they directly refute his central argument. By the way, if you haven't seen the first two parts of the series, I recommend that you do so before watching this video to better understand the context of this discussion. All links are in the description. First, in Sahim Muslim, under the chapter titled The Prohibition of Initiating the Greeting with the People of the Book, we read, Muhammad instructed his followers, do not greet the Jews and the Christians before they greet you, and when you meet any of them on the road, force them to go to the narrowest part of it. So the Jews are not allowed to walk in the center of the street, which is reserved for Muslims only. They are forced to the edges so as not to get in the way of Muslims. Also in Sahih Muslim, there is this prophecy that Muhammad makes about the end of times. The last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree. And the stone or the tree would say, O Muslim or servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. But the Gharqad tree would not say that, for it is the tree of the Jews. So this is an explicit call for a complete and comprehensive Jewish genocide that would need to take place at the end times by Muslim hands. For some mind-boggling reason though, Muhammad accuses a particular tree of being a Jewish ally and trying to save them. Don't know what Muhammad had against this particular tree, but shouldn't he complain to God about it? Because obviously if all the other trees are ratting the Jews out but not this one, then God must not have allowed this tree to speak, because newsflash, trees don't speak. So when this Gharqad tree doesn't say anything, that's just the tree being a normal tree. All the other trees are the crazy ones. Also, if trees can choose whether or not to rat Jews out to Muslims trying to kill them, then doesn't that mean that they're conscious and have free will? And if they're conscious, does that mean that if we chop off their branches, it would be like chopping off the limbs of an animal while it's still alive? And if they have free will, then they too are going to be judged and sent to heaven and hell, right? I don't know why I'm even trying to parse the logic here. This whole narrative is totally insane. Anyway, there are also other authentic hadiths with similar messages, like this one here where Muhammad says, you will fight against the Jews and you will kill them until even a stone would say, come here Muslim, there is a Jew hiding himself behind me, kill him. Moving on, in Sahih Bukhari, we have this hadith, when the last moment of the life of Allah's messenger came, he started putting his khamisa on his face, and when he felt hot and short of breath, he took it off his face and said, may Allah curse the Jews and Christians, for they built places of worship at the graves of their prophets. The Prophet was warning Muslims of what those had done. So he's on the verge of dying here, but he still makes the effort to curse the Jews and Christians before peacing out. And finally, this narration from Sahih Muslim where Muhammad says, no Muslim would die, but Allah would admit in his stead a Jew or a Christian in hellfire. So if a Muslim is going to hell, Allah would replace him with a Jew or Christian instead. Now, as an aside, this hadith is so mind-bogglingly illogical that even Muslim scholars struggle to explain it and end up resorting to such extreme mental gymnastics that it would put even veteran politicians to shame. I don't have the time to go over it here, but once I'm done with the videos for this topic, I will go over this hadith in detail next, so if you're interested, stay tuned. So, do these statements of Muhammad give the impression that he had a favorable opinion about the Jews? Not surprising then, right, that Hijab completely ignores all these statements of the Prophet, which he's certainly aware of, and chooses to focus only on Muhammad defending Safiya from the criticism of his other wives. But that wasn't because she was Jewish. Muhammad was simply defending his own wife there. His opinion about the Jews can clearly be seen in these explicit statements of his about Jews. But this is not all. There's so much more that Hijab chooses to avoid bringing up here about the treatment of Jews. So let's go over some of it. First, let's take a look at this verse of the Quran that explains the law of retaliation in Islam. It's chapter number 2, verse 178. I have discussed the part of this verse that relates to the treatment of slaves in my earlier video about how Muslim apologists actively conceal the Islamic law that shows the mistreatment of slaves. But here I'm only going to focus on the part that deals with the treatment of non-Muslims. This verse states, Prescribed for you is legal retribution for those murdered, the free for the free, the slave for the slave, and the female for the female. So the verse is describing the punishment for murdering someone. Basically, the punishment is death, unless the family of the victim forgives the murderer. But when we look at the exegesis of this verse by the classical scholars of tafsir, that's when a lot of exceptions get introduced for this law. Here's what Imam Ibn Kathir says in his tafsir, which is probably the most famous tafsir of the Quran in the Islamic world. He says, Allah's statement, the free for the free, the slave for the slave, and the female for the female, was abrogated by the statement, life for life. However, the majority of scholars agree that the Muslim is not killed for a disbeliever whom he kills. Al-Bukhari reported that Ali narrated that Allah's Messenger said, the Muslim is not killed for the disbeliever whom he kills. No opinion that opposes this ruling could stand correct, nor is there an authentic hadith to contradict it. However, Abu Hanifa thought that the Muslim could be killed for a disbeliever. And here is one other classical exegesis of this verse from the tafsir of Imam Qurtubi, who says the same thing. He says, the majority also agree that a Muslim should not be killed in retaliation for an unbeliever, since the Prophet said, a Muslim is not killed in retaliation for an unbeliever. Al-Bukhari transmitted this from Ali bin Abi Talib. So the correct ruling for retribution for murder is that if a non-Muslim kills a Muslim, he can be killed if the family of the killer chooses this option. But if a Muslim kills a non-Muslim, then the Muslim cannot be killed. And this ruling is justified by the statement of Prophet Muhammad, where he says, a Muslim should not be killed in retaliation for the murder of a disbeliever, as we see here in the Sunan of Ibn Majah. And as Ibn Kathir mentioned in his tafsir, this report is also here in the Sahih of Al-Bukhari. And a more detailed version can be read in Sunan Tirmidhi, where the Prophet says, the Muslim is not killed for killing a disbeliever, and that the blood money paid for a disbeliever is half the blood money paid for a Muslim. So even the blood money, which is the money that is paid by the family of the murderer to the victim's family, is half if the murdered person is a Jew or a Christian. So this is how the lives of Jews and Christians are valued in Prophet Muhammad's own words. Explicit discrimination based on religious faith. And Islamic scholars explicitly say this in their texts too. The Hanafi school of Islamic law is the largest Sunni denomination in the world today. As I've mentioned in a previous video, the book Al-Hidayah of Imam Marghinani, which comes in 4 volumes, is considered by Muslim scholars to be the foremost source of Hanafi law. As stated on kitabun.com, it is the corpus of Hanafi law in its approved and preferred form, and forges an organic link with other schools of law. There is no book that can match the power of Al-Hidayah as a teaching manual. Education in Islamic law is not complete without this book. So in the second volume of this book, in the section of Jizya, we read, the dhimmis are required to differentiate themselves from Muslims in their clothing, vehicles, saddle, and headgear. They are not allowed to ride horses or use weapons. And in the book Al-Jami' al-Saghir, it is stated, the dhimmis are required to wear distinctive clothes and ride saddles that are shaped like palm leaves. They are required to do this to demonstrate their inferiority and protect the weaker Muslims. This is because Muslims are honored while the dhimmi is humiliated. They are not to be greeted first, and the road is made narrow for them. If there is no distinguishing mark on them, they may be treated like Muslims by people who don't recognize them as non-Muslims, but this is not permissible. So Hanafi law is calling for explicit discrimination against them, not just in how they are treated, but also in how they dress and travel. And this here is what the famous Hanbali scholar of Islamic law, Imam al-Buhuti, says in his Sharh Muntaha al-Iradat. A Muslim, even if he apostatizes from Islam, is not killed after killing because of a non-Muslim, regardless of whether the killed person is a follower of a book, that is a Christian or a Jew, or otherwise a dhimmi or a person under protection. This was narrated on the authority of Umar, Uthman, Ali, Zayd bin Thabit, and Muawiyah. Based on the hadith, the blood of Muslims is equal, and the lowest of them can guarantee their protection. A believer may not be killed because of a non-Muslim. And this is because retaliation requires equality, and there is no equality between a disbeliever and a Muslim. So, in summary, Muhammad instructs his followers to not greet Jews and Christians and to force them to walk on the edges of the streets, and says that in the end times Muslims are called by God to completely genocide the Jews, and that when a Muslim is supposed to go to hell, God will replace him or her with a Jew or a Christian, and that to his dying breath Muhammad was cursing Jews and Christians. In addition to all this, Muhammad explicitly instructed his followers that a Muslim cannot be killed for killing non-Muslims, but that non-Muslims can be killed if the roles were reversed. And even the blood money for Jews and Christians is half that of Muslims. Not one of these actual teachings of Muhammad were brought up by Hijab in his assessment of the treatment of Jews under Islam. All he brings up is that Muhammad married Safiya, a Jewish woman, after he had her family killed and then defended her from the taunts of his other wives. How does Muhammad defending his wife negate all the discrimination against Jews that Muhammad explicitly promoted? Hijab, of course, has no answer for this. But that's Muslim apologetics for you in a nutshell. It's important to note here that Hijab himself chooses to live in a non-Muslim country where his civil liberties are guaranteed, including the right to not be discriminated against because of his religion. But when it comes to non-Muslims living in Muslim nations, Hijab explicitly defends discrimination against them based on their religion. In my next video in this series, I'll discuss the claims Hijab makes about the nature of jizya, which is the tax imposed by Islam on non-Muslims under its rule.